It looks like we might see a major campaign promise become reality. President-elect Trump is looking into the possibility of privatizing the United States Postal Service.
Yeah, it's interesting how this is coming up again so soon, especially considering all the work that went into restructuring the Postal Service during Trump's last term.
Definitely a lot of people are surprised, and it's starting conversations about whether this is the right move.
The argument is that it's not the government's job to keep an organization afloat when it isn't doing well financially.
And some of the people who support privatization feel really strongly about it. They want it to happen quickly.
But there's a long history to think about here. The Postal Service has been a core part of American life since it started in 1775.
And it's changed over time. It switched over to a model where it supports itself financially back in 1970, and it's still really popular with the American public.
But we can't ignore the fact that the Postal Service has been facing some serious money problems these last few years.
They've reported that they've lost billions of dollars, and their debts are adding up to a really big number.
A big part of it is that the amount of mail they're delivering is going down, and the increase in package deliveries hasn't been enough to make up for the lost money.
Which makes you wonder what would happen to the growing e-commerce industry if the Postal Service were privatized.
It's a good question to ask. The Postal Service is really important, especially for small businesses and people in rural areas who rely on its affordable and wide-reaching network.
And we can't forget about companies like Amazon, who really depend on the Postal Service to deliver packages that last a little bit of the way.
It shows just how much the Postal Service is tied to the whole e-commerce world. Privatization could affect the entire industry in ways we don't even realize yet.
Something else to remember is the Postal Service's Universal Service Obligation, which basically says they have to deliver to every address in the country, no matter how far away or hard it is to reach.
That's a really important part of what they do. It makes sure everyone can get their mail, even people who live in really remote areas. It's probably not something a private company focused on profits would care about.
And that brings up worries that there might be places that don't get good service anymore, especially in rural areas that depend a lot on the Postal Service.
It's something we have to consider carefully, especially for communities that already have a hard time getting essential services and goods. Privatization might make those inequalities even worse.
We also have to think about how people might react politically if the Postal Service is privatized.
For sure. There could be a lot of pushback, even from Republicans who represent rural districts that rely heavily on the Postal Service.
Think about Alaska, for example. The Postal Service is really important for their economy and a way of life.
It wouldn't be surprising if representatives from similar areas fought really hard to protect the Postal Service and the role it plays in their communities.
Even though some people want to privatize the Postal Service, it's been working to modernize and make its operations more efficient.
They've taken steps to cut costs, like changing work hours and how much they spend on transportation.
And they're trying to update their mail processing and delivery schedules to keep up with the best practices in the industry.
These are all ways to help the Postal Service run better and be more competitive in a world that's changing really fast.
But the history between President-elect Trump and the Postal Service makes this debate even more complicated.
The things he said about the agency in the past and the changes he's pushed for, like raising prices, definitely point to a rocky relationship.
And what he did during his first term, like trying to move certain Postal Service responsibilities to the Treasury Department, shows that he wants to make some big changes to how the organization works.
It makes you think there could be some significant shifts in how the Postal Service operates and what its role is in the federal government.
And of course, we can't forget about the 2020 election and how much attention was on the Postal Service's ability to handle mail-in voting.
The Postal Service did show that it could deliver ballots well, but it also brought to light how important the Postal Service is in making sure our democracy works.
And if we're going to see even more people voting by mail in future elections, what happens to the Postal Service could have a big impact on how Americans cast their votes.
That's an important point. It's really important that mail-in voting stays secure and accessible, and any changes to the Postal Service should definitely keep those things in mind. This brings up some really big questions about what's going to happen to the Postal Service. If it becomes a private company, how will that change the way it works?
And would a private company still have to deliver to every address?
Those are the main things people are talking about when it comes to privatization. There's a real worry that service could be disrupted and prices could go up.
Especially for people in rural areas or places that are already underserved who depend on the Postal Service because it's affordable and accessible.
It's about making sure everyone has equal access to services that are important. Privatization could end up creating a system where people in areas that are more profitable get better service.
Another important thing to consider is what's going to happen to all the people who work for the Postal Service.
Hundreds of thousands of employees could be affected. We're talking about their jobs, their pensions, their benefits.
These are people who have spent their whole careers working in public service. It's a serious concern that their livelihoods could be disrupted.
It's the human side of things that often gets lost when people are focused on efficiency and saving money.
And then there's the question of how much it's going to cost consumers and businesses. Will a private company keep things affordable, or are we going to see prices go up?
That's a really important point. The way the Postal Service sets its prices is a big reason why it's accessible to so many people. If it's privatized, that could all change.
It could mean that some services become too expensive for people who rely on them being affordable.
It's like what we've seen with other essential services like healthcare when they've been privatized. Finding the right balance between making a profit and making sure things are accessible is tough.
And speaking of essential services, the Postal Service is really important for delivering medications, especially for people in rural areas who might not have a pharmacy nearby.
It's something they do that doesn't get a lot of attention. They make sure people get the medicine they need no matter where they live.
It just goes to show that the Postal Service is about more than just letters and packages. It's a really important part of our infrastructure that supports all kinds of things in our daily lives.
Its impact is much bigger than what we see on the surface. The way the Postal Service is connected to other things like healthcare is something we need to think about.
This is a complicated issue that touches on economics, politics, social equality, even healthcare. It's not an easy decision to make.
There are a lot of things to consider. Any decision about the future of the Postal Service needs to look at all the potential outcomes, both good and bad.
We can't just think about what will happen right away. We need to think about what the long-term effects will be. What kind of postal service do we want in the future, and how do we make sure it can survive?
That's the big question. We need to find a way to preserve the role the Postal Service has always played while also adapting to the needs of a digital world.
It requires an approach that takes everyone into account, from regular people to businesses to the government.
At the end of the day, any decision about the Postal Service needs to be made openly and honestly so that the public knows what's going on and can have a say.
Because the Postal Service belongs to all of us, what happens to it should be decided by everyone and should reflect what we value, what's important to us.
It's up to all of us to make sure the Postal Service keeps serving the country in a way that's fair and effective.
This has been a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. It's clear that there's a lot more to think about as this story develops.
It's just the start of a complex and evolving conversation. We need to stay informed and engaged to understand how things unfold and what it means for the Postal Service and the country as a whole. We're kind of at a turning point here. Do we try to hold on to this institution that's been around for centuries, or do we go with a system that's more about the free market?
It's a really tough decision, and there are good arguments on both sides.
People who like the traditional way of doing things say that the Postal Service is super important, it connects us all, and it's a big part of our democracy. They don't want to see it controlled by market forces.
But then there are people who think privatizing it would make it run better, come up with new ideas, and be more financially stable in the long run.
And then there's the whole universal service obligation thing. Would a private company really be okay with delivering to every single address, no matter how far out of the way or how much money they lose doing it?
I think it all comes down to what we value as a society. Are we more about making sure everyone has access and things are fair? Or are we more about making a profit and doing things efficiently?
We're seeing this same kind of debate in a lot of different areas, from healthcare to education. It's a bigger discussion about what role the government should play in providing services that everyone needs.
It feels like we're at a point where we have to decide what kind of country we want to live in and how much of a role we want the government to have in making sure everyone can get the services they need.
It's a debate that's probably going to keep going for a while. It'll be interesting to see how people's opinions change as we talk about it more.
One thing's for sure, though. This is something we need to pay attention to and think about carefully. The decisions we make now are going to affect people for years to come.
It's a good reminder that this affects all of us. We need to stay informed, talk to each other, and stand up for the kind of postal service that fits our needs and our values.
Well put. There's a lot to think about, and we'll be keeping an eye on how this all plays out.
Me too. It's a really interesting example of how politics, economics, and society all intersect.
Thanks for helping us break down this complicated issue.
It is my pleasure.
Goodbye, and see you in the next video.